Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Slightly unusual topic today, lager. Love it or loathe it, it is a fixture in just about every single pub in Britain. Regular viewers of the channel will know I'm a real ale man, a bitter drinker, and personally, whenever there's a choice, I'd rather have something a bit more traditionally English. But lager has actually been served in the pubs of Britain for a fair bit longer than you might have at first thought. I'd assumed, perhaps naively, that lager was something that started to emerge in pubs here in Britain in perhaps the second half of the 20th century, spurred on by the proliferation of keg beers, thanks to the infamous Watney's Red Barrel. So imagine my surprise when I was researching the dead pubs of Oxford Street a couple of years back, and I stumbled across an article about this man who'd stolen a few items from the Black Horse, a pub which used to stand on the corner of Oxford Street and Dean Street. I went into the prosecutor's house and asked for a glass of lager beer. That was in 1895. As it happens, they didn't have any, and he had to settle for a glass of bitter instead. He's sort of the opposite of me there, isn't he? But the point is, 130 years ago, here in London, it was not considered an unusual thing to go into a pub and order a lager. Perhaps this shouldn't be so surprising. We were already importing sherry from Spain, wine from France, why not also lager from Bavaria? Prolific beer historian Ron Pattison, author of the Shut Up About Barclay Perkins blog, has written about this. He's on YouTube now as well. He's published a book on the history of lager in England, which I'd recommend to anyone who wants to go deeper into the subject. I'll put a link to that in the description along with his YouTube channel. Although there were some earlier experimental forays into brewing lager in Britain, going all the way back to the 1830s, interest in lager here really started to gain momentum following the Exposition of Paris, sometimes also referred to as the World Fair of Paris, in 1867. One exhibit there which found particular success with British visitors was the Vienna Beer Hall, and following that, several places selling Viennese lager started to pop up in London and elsewhere in Britain. These were met with at least some scepticism initially. This article in 1869 is a bit sniffy about the Austrian incursion into London's drinking establishments. There is, to many minds, something approaching to audacity in the notion of foreigners attempting to import their native beer and to sell it at a profit in the capital of England. The author there being a bit protective about British beer in the face of a would-be usurper from overseas. Sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? It does give us some interesting details though. It confirms this was indeed a draft product at the time, imported in barrels from Austria, not a bottled beer. This was over 60 years before Watney's first forays into keg beer, or container beer as they called it initially, and although coincidentally the 1860s was the same decade that Louis Pasteur conducted his first experiments on pasteurisation of beer, I don't believe that process was applied commercially until the 1870s. Possibly Danish brewery Carlsberg were the first to do that. The 1870s was also the decade in which Carl von Linde built the first refrigeration system for beer. And yet another important innovation came in that decade. Lorenz Adalbert Enzinger's beer filter was invented in 1878, arguably the first mechanised system for filtration of beer in an industrial context, although of course more traditional methods existed prior to that. So this Viennese lager, sold in London in 1869, before all of those advances in beer production in the following decade, would likely have been unpressurised, unpasteurised, unfiltered, not refrigerated, and served from, I believe, wooden barrels via a beer engine. Would it actually have met Camera's definition for a real ale then? Somewhat consistent with lager in pubs today, it was also sold at a premium. According to Ron Pattison, something like 3 times the price of what Londoners would have paid for, say, mild at that time. It does make you wonder what sort of condition it was in after that long journey from Vienna to London, but apparently by 1873 that could be achieved in just 49 hours, at least for passengers, probably a bit longer than that for freight. And yet, despite all the sniffiness from certain commentators at the time, despite the high prices, and despite the fact it was likely not in the best condition given the journey involved with the technology at the time, it somehow still gained a following. That initial interest in imported lager, and particularly the prices that the pubs could charge for it, did not go unnoticed by Britain's brewers, and in the following couple of decades there were several revived attempts to brew it here. Several new businesses were launched in the hope of riding this wave, but most were short-lived ventures that disappeared again a few years later. The Bayerische Lager Brewery was formed in 1881 with plans to redevelop the Tower Brewery in Eltham, Kent for the brewing of lager. They went bust a few years later in 1888. Similarly, the English Lager Beer Brewery emerged in 1890. They had plans to build a brewery on the outskirts of Bath, but once again, that venture folded a few years later. However, other attempts were more long-lived, and one which emerged in the 1880s might surprise you, especially if you've ever spent any time in Scotland. Tennent's. Adverts for it first appear in 1889, but by that time it was already described as being sold everywhere. Presumably they're talking about the Glasgow area. That was the same year that the company established a purpose-built lager brewery, and they'd already been brewing lager in Glasgow since at least 1885. It's a brewing company with a long history, founded all the way back in 1740. Any former residents of Scotland who find themselves a bit homesick and craving what could arguably be described as Scotland's national lager might be pleased to know that there are in fact a handful of pubs here in London, one including the Jeremy Bentham here near Warren Street, where you can find Tennent's on tap. Into the 20th century then, and Ron's book goes into much more detail about developments in lager in that era. But one key takeaway is that, until the latter half, lager remained a niche product. Until 1960, lager had accounted for 1% or less of all beer consumed in Britain. By the year 2000, over 60% of beer sold in Britain was lager. Many factors contributed to the meteoric rise of lager in the 4 decades in between. Partly it was the result of all those mergers and acquisitions in the brewing industry, which led to the demise of many small traditional regional brewers to be replaced with macro brewing facilities supplying the whole country, owned by just a handful of multinational conglomerates. These behemoths were often not interested in preserving the traditional cask ales from the small breweries they had swallowed up, instead replacing them in their tied pub estates with mass-produced keg products. Chief among those was lager. Another factor was the oft-quoted demon of cheap supermarket beer and the related shift to drinking at home rather than in pubs. Traditional real ale was always at a disadvantage when served from anything other than cask, due to that all-important secondary fermentation. I think it's also fair to say that the familiarity and consistency of lager works in its favour. Cask ales do require a bit more care and attention. They're prone to spoilage if not well kept, but that is generally not a problem with beers like lager, which are delivered from a keg. So we've seen that lager has been available in at least some pubs in Britain for over 150 years. There have been 1 or 2 domestic success stories in that time, like Tennent's in Scotland, but despite that long history of lager being brewed and consumed here, it's interesting that still today the vast majority of the most popular lagers are either imports or international brands brewed here under licence. You might think, given all that time, that we might have made lager our own, and yet still in 2026, international lager, or at least beer that gives off that impression, reigns supreme. Looking at Heineken's beer report for 2026, the biggest lager in on-sales outlets, that's pubs, restaurants, etc., in terms of sales value is Birra Moretti, worth £1 billion annually. The next biggest is Carling. As you may or may not be aware, it actually hails from Canada originally, but has been brewed here under licence since the 1950s. In third place is Madrí Excepcional. This is an odd case of a lager which has Spanish branding, but has only ever been brewed here in Britain, although it was apparently developed in collaboration with Spanish brewers LAGER. It's impressive that it has reached such lofty heights in such a short space of time, having only been introduced in 2020. Looking at fourth and fifth place, Peroni's Nastro Azzurro and also Cruz Campo, it is slightly surprising, to me at least, how much Italy and Spain, or at least beers that claim to have origins in those countries, dominate the top 5. Although many other fantastic drinks come from that pair of nations, they're not traditionally renowned as two of Europe's great beer-producing regions, are they? It's slightly bizarre that Germany, the country where lager was invented, is nowhere to be seen in the top 10 best-selling draft lagers in the UK today. It's also a bit of a shame that, aside from Tennent's, none of the top spots seem to be occupied by genuinely British brands. They all seem to have origins from elsewhere, or in the case of Madrí, at least pretend to. There have of course been some efforts in recent years to make a more British lager, and perhaps the first one that springs to mind is Jeremy Clarkson's Hawkstone. That is made with barley grown, I believe, on Diddley Squat Farm, although I believe the hops are a bit more international. They're a blend of possibly British, German, American and New Zealand hops. Camden Hells perhaps also deserves a mention. That's where I'm sat now. It is a brewery that is not far from where I live in North London, actually in Kentish Town rather than Camden Town. I think it originally started in Hampstead. They still do experimental brewing here and also brewery tours, and there's a beer hall here, but I think the bulk of the production is now in a brewery on the outskirts of London. This is a blend of a Helles and a Pilsner style to make their Camden Hells, and as lagers go, I've always been quite a fan of this. Plus there are of course a few regional breweries which have started producing their own lager with some local success, like Korev from St Austell's in Cornwall. In conclusion then, lager has been with us for a fair bit longer than most people might at first think, and given the fact that it is now Britain's biggest selling style of beer, there's no hiding from the fact that it is here to stay. Again, it's not my first choice for a style of beer, and despite the bulk of it being brewed here today, it still seems to have to pretend it's from somewhere else to get anybody to buy it. Marketing types would probably describe these as aspirational products and say that they have positive associations with holidays on the continent and so on. I do sort of get that. I've had some great holidays in Italy, Spain, even France, and I suppose from time to time if I go to, say, an Italian restaurant, I am slightly trying to relive that atmosphere. But when I'm in one of my favourite traditional historic English pubs, the notion that I might be daydreaming about being anywhere else is something that I struggle to grasp. Maybe that's just me though. Right, that's going to be it from me then. If you found this video interesting, then please consider buying a copy of Ron's book. I found it invaluable in the making of this video, and prompting a few extra sales would be my way of saying thanks to Ron. A Kindle version is available on Amazon for a mere £7.81, the sort of price you could easily pay for a pint of premium lager here in London, although I should say this was only £6 the Tennent's here at the Jeremy Bentham. You don't actually need a Kindle device to read it, any old laptop or phone will do. Please also consider subscribing to Ron's channel. As noted, he is on YouTube now. He's an absolute font of knowledge for all things beer history related. And in addition to that book about the history of lager in Britain, he has a number of other books on beer history related topics. Cheers.